Welcome to Rev'd Up for Sunday. We're the clergy of St. Mark's Episcopal Church in New Canaan, Connecticut. I'm Peter Walsh.
I'm John Kennedy.
I'm Elizabeth Garnsey.
And today we are taking a look at a fantastic passage of Scripture. We're taking a look at the call of Levi, the call of Matthew. We're taking a look at a dinner that he has with the tax collectors and the sinners. And then he seems to be called out or heads out the door. And what do we have? We have the ruler of the synagogue coming to him and a woman who's been hemorrhaging for all these years. Somebody dies, somebody comes back alive, somebody's cured, and somebody gets good hunk of teaching, right? And Jesus just says a few things that, I can't help shout out to start with. Go and learn what this means. Take heart, daughter. And then the quote that we don't hear much from Jesus, go away. Matthew chapter 9, verses 9 to 13, and then verses 18 to 26. As Jesus was walking along, he saw a man called Matthew sitting at the tax booth, and he said to him, "Follow me." And he got up and followed him. And as he sat at dinner in the house, many tax collectors and sinners came and were sitting with him and his disciples. When the Pharisees saw this, they said to his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" But when he heard this, he said, "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice, for I have come to call not the righteous, but sinners." And while he was saying these things to them, suddenly a leader of the synagogue came in and knelt before him, saying, "My daughter has just died, but come and lay your hand on her, and she will live." And Jesus got up and followed him with his disciples. Then suddenly a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years came up behind him and touched the fringe of his cloak. For she said to herself, "If I only touch his cloak, I will be made well." Jesus turned, and seeing her, he said, "Take heart, daughter, for your faith has made you well." And instantly the woman was made well. When Jesus came to the leader's house and saw the flute players and the crowd making a commotion, he said, "Go away, for the girl is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. But when the crowd had been put outside, he went in and took her by the hand, and the girl got up. And the report of this spread throughout the district.
This gospel is, I think, classically Matthean in the sense that it plays a lot with the references to the Hebrew scriptures and to their tradition. And just to kind of pull back again for the beginning of our podcast, the Matthean community are people in Antioch who have been, cast out of their synagogue communities and really formed a new community, and they have to orient around Jesus, and they're largely Jewish, but with some Gentile followers now of this way. But, everything that Jesus does in Matthew, it's whether his words or his actions, or whether he's like declaring forgiveness or healing or, raising someone from the dead, he's generating controversy. And in the same time, in that process, he's creating new communities. So I think all that's happening in microcosm here in this passage where, he's calling Matthew the consummate sinner as a tax collector who conspires with, perceived to conspire with the Romans. And he's just persona non grata among his people as taking more than his share, whatever tax collectors are notorious for doing. And Jesus doesn't call him as much as command him, come and follow me. And Matthew's not volunteering. He's not like looking for a new job or anything, but it's so compelling. And then they end up at this table surrounded with other tax collectors and sinners. And so just around the table already, Jesus has created this new kind of community, and he's generating huge controversy.
Yeah, controversy and community. I like that.
Yeah, I'm struck by all of that and by the continuity and the discontinuity with Jesus' own tradition, his own Hebrew tradition, because simply by having a meal with tax collectors and sinners, he's violating ritual purity laws. He's breaking the rules, and again, he does that with the woman and with the hemorrhage, particularly if this is any kind of menstrual bleeding it's not made clear what the nature of the bleeding is. But if it is that, then this would, physical contact with anybody in that state would make Jesus unclean as well. He doesn't care. And yet he's the new Moses, according to Matthew, which we get a little bit of in this passage as well. But perhaps we should stick with the opening chunk of it, because it's really two.
Yeah, I like it that Jesus doesn't care. What does Jesus care? And the way Jesus does care, because later on he's going to call her daughter, and he clearly cares for her as a daughter. Yeah. But going back to the beginnings here, just from the big 30,000 feet to go down a few thousand feet. One of the things that I love, it says, as Jesus was walking along, and I'm always reminded of what you used to talk about in Luke's, Jesus is always on the move, and here he is walking along, and then it says, and he saw. Anytime Jesus sees you, he just doesn't notice you, and he sees into your soul. So we get Jesus walking along, seeing into Matthew's soul, and then says, "Follow me," which of course is the lingua franca for "be my disciple." This is to follow, is discipleship. And so right from the start, we have Jesus, and then launching in with these folks who are completely persona non grata. Those are his people, right? And I think, just to point out something in all this, is that when Jesus sits with these folks and he says, no need, the physician question, the physician comes not for those who are well, but for those who are sick, that Jesus is absorbing and using their language. This is not the kind of language that Jesus usually uses, where he calls anybody righteous. I mean, in Matthew's gospel, he's going to say, call nobody good but God alone, right? And then Paul picks this up in Romans, where he said, no one is righteous in the law. And that Jesus is using their lingua franca, he's using their way of talking, that he's going to then zing right around him when he says, go and learn what this means. And I'll just say a word about that, and then we'll launch into, let you guys take, I desire mercy and not sacrifice. But one of the things I like about this in particular is he takes them and then he twists this and go and learn what this means. I think that's one of the great lines of Scripture.
It is.
One of the great lines of Scripture, because what he is talking about is so radical that they're just not going to get this. They're not going to get knocked off their horse on the road to Damascus and get the whole thing right away, right? And because this is a complete turnover of their understanding of religion, their understanding of God, their understanding of where they stand, as a human being before the divine. He's turning the whole thing upside down. Yeah,
completely. I wish I'd inserted at the beginning, when Jesus calls Matthew to follow him, the next sentence is, and he got up and followed him. That's just such a radical shift. And it reminds me of Abraham. I just made a note to myself that, when God calls Abraham to leave everything and go out from his house and start walking,
oh wow,
it's kind of an incredible call story, and I just meant to mention that as another allusion to. Oh, I
thought you were going to go to the Sea of Galilee and the call of Peter and James.
That too,
yeah. They're all that in a way, but I think for Matthew in particular, he's recasting the whole story of the Israelite history. So I wanted to throw that in before we get to the Hosea quote, but because all along here Jesus is, as you say, you bring up that I desire mercy, not sacrifice.
Can I say one thing?
Yeah.
Holy cow. That just reminded me of something. Just R.I.P. and God rest his soul to Tim Keller. If those of you who are listening to the podcast, if you haven't discovered Tim Keller, just type it into YouTube and then listen to anything he says. He really was an incredible teacher.
He was, yeah.
And I was listening to a podcast that he did, and he was talking about this passage and this call story, and he was saying, to be a Christian, this lays out how one could say that they were a Christian. And he was saying Christians have a sense of being called by a person. It's not that you suddenly assent to the creed. It's not that you decide, I was vaguely baptized and must be a Christian as a kid, and now I'm kind of getting warmed up and I just want to pray harder. I'm going to take it seriously. What he's saying is the distinguishing characteristic is that you're called out by a power beyond yourself. Yeah. Anyway, sorry, that reminded me of that. The power beyond is calling you, and that's what causes the movement.
Yeah. Right. Wow. It's Jesus himself who is so compelling, and these people that he just sees and calls, they can't say no. Yeah. They want to say no.
Wow. Yeah. Amen to that. And perhaps that helps illuminate the nature and the cause of Jesus so radically challenging and even subverting, flipping around the religiosity that he's encountering and butting up against in the Pharisees in this story. The Pharisees were devout, pious people, but I thought this might be a bit of an overgeneralization, but at least as they come across in the Gospels, they care, their focus is just on following the rules, just conformity to the law, and Jesus is calling people to himself. It's not about adherence to certain laws, although, it might look like that on the surface. If you're following this rabbi in his way, it's going to look like, you do this, you don't do that, and so on. But it's really about being drawn to this person, and mercy, not sacrifice, and, whether or not there's purity codes being broken in people coming to Jesus and Jesus coming to people. The thing that matters is not any of that. It matters that people encounter Jesus and they experience life and healing from him. And it's just an astonishing thing, really, thinking about Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew, as a thoroughly Jewish text intended to reach a Jewish audience, introducing somebody for which there was a Jesus in his way, for which there was, from what I understand, very little precedent. He's quoting Hosea here, so there is some, resonance with the tradition that followed, but it's something radically new as well.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think he's totally upending their usual understanding of their own story, their own scriptures. And I think for Matthew, this is personal. By Matthew, I mean for the community, the Matthean community, it's personal that they would be the ostracized. And human communities everywhere for all time have their groups that they ostracize and cast out. Whoever's not conforming to the agreed upon behavior standards are less than or not acceptable. And we all do it. We all have our tax collectors and sinners in our communities. Yep. But and here Jesus is, so the people Matthew is writing to are experiencing this in real time, that they've been cast out of their synagogues, as I said. There's all these different groups of Jewish people at this time who have had to reorient with the loss of their temple in the wake of the utter and complete destruction. The temple was destroyed into rubble, dust. The high altar was like crushed to smithereens, and I think it's Vespasian. Is that the one?
How do you say that?
The emperor at the time, who decided to finally do away with this community once and for all. He said, no pillaging, no looting, just crush it to smithereens so there's nothing left. And so they would literally have nothing to rebuild upon physically. And so all of these Jews are scattered from Jerusalem, and they have to go and regroup and reorganize. And there are all these different groups doing it in their different ways. Like the high priests were murdered, their families were murdered. There are some leaders who escaped, but whatever leaders escaped gather themselves together to rebuild. It's a terrible, tragic part of Jewish history. Yeah. But there is this little group of people who, for them, their Messiah had already come. It was Jesus, and this is the group that this gospel's written for, and they have to learn what it means to be, complete and utter loss of their roots and their center, something they thought was always permanent and going to be there for them. And they have to orient around being shut out from the rest of their community because they're following Jesus as the Messiah, having come already. And they orient around the teachings of Jesus and the way he operated in the world. And so I think, the people who are first to be given this text, it's incredibly encouraging, comforting to hear Jesus say these words, that mercy, not sacrifice, is that, they can't even make sacrifices anymore. They don't have a temple. Right. Also, these people that would be shunned, sacrificed to keep the community pure. All of these mechanisms are at work here. And there's Jesus not, treating the sick. He's just becoming their companion, and they're not sick. It's just that Jesus is kind of exposing these things at work. And So, I mean, for me, that's very interesting that this is how the first Christians got there.
Oh, I was never anywhere
bearings,
near
you
that
know?
at all. That's interesting to me that you've put it in that context. I was in the context of Jesus as shocking wisdom teacher and his breaking the altars.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, yeah.
Our inner
Indeed,
altars.
yeah.
And I think that, hey, I'm just going to say it. I think the Pharisees got a bad rap greatly in the Gospels. I think they become sometimes the straw dog for certain kinds of teachings. I think everybody in the United States has their own Pharisaical ways, whether or not they're religious or not. They're you know what you're always talking about, the in people and the out people. People who aren't religious are religious. They just don't have. They have their own gods, maybe not what we would consider or who we would consider God.
Definitely.
And when Jesus comes through with I desire mercy and not sacrifice, that's the kind of line. I mean, Tim Keller called that like the Sermon on the Mount in one sentence.
Yeah.
That this is about conversion of heart, what God desires, not what you desire, not the worlds that you build, not the thing that you think, but think and be as God is. And God, and that is, you know, help me out here. The Hebrew word hesed, which means steadfast love or steadfast faith. And that the only times that we truly experience holiness is when we get obliterated by the being of God and the grace of God, which shows us that all of our judgmentalism is as a match tower that is worthless, and it gets knocked over easily when we get in touch with the mercy of God, and that the being that everything is made in love and for love, and that we are to first of all love before we build castles in the sky. We build our own Babylonian towers to the divine. And I think, so that's when I hear this, I mean, I just feel like Jesus is obliterating not only the Hebrew portions of the kind of piety, but he's obliterating Democrats who don't want to talk Republicans who won't talk to Democrats.
Yeah.
He's obliterating everybody here, all that kind of polarization.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah. Astonishing how much is packed into this phrase, and also astonishing that it only appears in Matthew.
Mm-hmm.
It is an astonishing thing. I mean, unless we imagine that this was put into Jesus's mouth later, like after the destruction of the temple, which I suppose is possible. If you imagine Jesus saying this in his lifetime, the temple was still there. The system was still in operation just for a little bit longer, but nobody knew it was coming, except maybe Jesus, based on his comments later in the gospel. But anyway, here Jesus is saying that something that is perceived to be so central, so important to his people's relationship to God and to his people's identity is not the thing. And I mean, to keep going with your contemporary connections and the Phariseeism of us, of our world. We make idols out of all sorts of things, out of our political allegiance, out of our social status, out of our achievements, and we think we get life from these things. We think that you start setting them aside or deconstructing or depedestalizing some of them, and chaos will break out, and we don't know who we are as individuals and as a people. But really, these things are not where life is to be found. Like, it's fine. Like, Jesus was not saying stop making temple sacrifices. And in other places, he say go make your sacrifice, whatever. But that's not really the thing.
I would never
that
say
gives
that.
us life.
I agree. I don't think Jesus would have had in mind, let's just do away with the temple.
Totally.
On the contrary, I mean, he was such a consummate, observant, faithful Jew.
Particularly
but he had
Matthew,
a different interpretation.
Right.
I just mean at the time of Matthew's writing, it had all happened.
It totally.
That was super interesting.
Yeah.
They ring differently in that.
Yeah.
So bring us to the ruler shows up at the meal.
Oh yeah.
Okay, so they're having this meal, and the ruler shows up.
Yeah.
And this story is told in Matthew, it's told in Luke, and it's told in Mark. I just think Matthew, again, going on the record, I think he does the worst job of all the other guys, but that's with this particular story. I think the other stories have more particularity to bring, and I think it brings a greater shape to the story. But so the ruler shows up.
As you would say, a different emphasis on disallowable. I mean, I think maybe the other accounts are more interesting to read, but in Matthew, all the focus is on Jesus. He doesn't really do a lot of crowds and details, and in this account. And here we have something super interesting because we have a leader of the synagogue, on the heels of other leaders of the synagogue coming to him, accusing him of eating with the wrong people. Now we have a leader coming and kneeling before him and asking for a resurrection from the dead. I mean, that's intense. And this leader is so direct, and he knows if you just come lay your hand on her, she'll live. Like, what kind of faith is that? That's insane. That's so interesting to me that it's a little bit easily overlooked that this person, given who he is, would ask for this. And, we always think of Lazarus as the one Jesus raised from the dead, but there are other accounts.
Yeah, so we've got
But then by contrast, so just to go put together with this other girl in the story, it's two girls being radically healed. That alone is worth noting. I think
cool.
It's really
I wouldn't have thought of that. I like that.
And then, so this woman who comes up behind Jesus, instead of, the leader of synagogue says, if you'll touch my daughter, she'll be healed. But in this case, it's this woman who goes and touches Jesus' clothes. And she doesn't even think he has to know she's there,
Yeah.
But in fact, it isn't the touch that heals her. It's Jesus turning and speaking to her. So, in both instances, Jesus is responding to these two asks, and just like Matthew responded to Jesus, gets up and follows. Here, this leader is saying, follow me home and you can heal my daughter. And Jesus, it's the same phrase, got up and followed him.
I know, it's awesome.
It's just super well done. I love that. And then with the woman, he's interrupted, and then there's whole business that you guys can talk about her being unclean and everything, and she doesn't really care, and they're just Jesus. But right when he's about to go into this leader of the synagogue's home, he's just been touched by a very unclean, impure person. Anyway, I'll stop there, but I love the juxtaposition of these two miracles. It's the double miracle, which also Matthew's famous for.
Indeed, yeah. I mean, here we really get Jesus as healer here, which is, as far as Matthew's construction of the story of Jesus goes, something that really began in earnest at the beginning of chapter 8. Up until that point in Matthew's gospel, Jesus is largely a man of the word. Sermon on the Mount is chapters 5
Oh, nice.
and 7.
That's a good call.
And here
like
he's becoming a healer. I mean, he's there's not to say that there's a hard division between the two. Of course there isn't, but in terms of what's foregrounded, so we get in this chunk of Matthew, beginning a chapter earlier at the beginning of 8, and continuing just a little bit beyond today's pericope, we get either 9 or 10 healings, depending on how they're counted. But I like 10 because that mirrors the 10 miracles. So Jesus does 10 miracles here, and it mirrors the 10 miracles of Moses in Exodus. I think it might be funny to kind of read them because they're so different. So this is what Moses does. First, water turned to blood. I mean, this is to help get the Israelites out of Egypt. The famous Exodus story of Moses' face-off with the Pharaoh. So first, water into blood. Second, frogs, then gnats, flies, livestock diseased, boils on people's skin, thunder and hail, locusts, darkness, and of course the death of the firstborn in the land of Egypt. Jesus' miracles: leper cleansed, centurion's servant healed, many healed at Peter's house, the stilling of the storm, the demoniac healed, a paralytic healed, a girl restored to life, a woman with hemorrhage healed, 2 blind men, and the healing of one who is mute. So these are all healing miracles, as quite different from, in contrast to the destructive miracles in Exodus. And of course, the destructive miracles were for a liberative purpose, a good and holy purpose, to get the people of God out of their captivity. But still, Jesus is like Moses, but he's not like Moses. Just like we're seeing earlier, like he's like Moses in his giving an authoritative teaching about the way that God is calling his people to live. But he's not like Moses, or at least the sort of Mosaic tradition, in that he's not really too concerned with some of the particulars of the inherited tradition that you think somebody carrying the mantle might be. just like we see here, that he doesn't really care about coming into contact with somebody who's ritually impure, a tradition that goes back to the books traditionally ascribed to Moses. So just a fascinating juxtaposition of again, continuity and discontinuity with the tradition.
Yeah, I mean, imagine if you could sit down and have dinner with Moses.
Yeah,
Talk to Moses. Like, what was it like when the frogs were hopping about and things like that? And then sit down and talk to Jesus and say, what was it like when? And I think that some of the issues here, as you both alluding, as we shift in the scripture a little bit here, from teaching to the miracle pieces, but that one of the things here is to do with the role of faith, and that the power is divine power, and faith is the agent. It's the way in which this divine power gets put. And I'm reminded of, if anybody talks to any kind of holistic healer in our world now, might say your energies have to participate in this healing process. You have to be open to that which I'm going to bring to you here, and here the faith is that opening to this, and that each of them have their way of doing this. One, lay hand on my daughter and she shall live, and just touch the fringe of his garment. And for those who are following, around pious Jews who are wearing the shawl, then they still do. Jewish people still, the men in particular, actually women too now in certain portions, have the 4 tassels with the blue, the same blue, I believe, that's the blue for the state of Israel. She just needs to touch one of these tassels. Right. I love it that she doesn't actually want to get his attention. Yeah. She wants to do it without his knowing, which is super the coolest faith action. I want to do this without his knowing this, and just the touch. And, and just to say, Sam Cooke in his early days before he and Sam and Dave got together, when he sings this as a gospel song, I think with something like the Spirit Souls or the Soul Spirits or something, which is his backup group at the time, and sings this story. It is the sweetest of sweet biblical stories done to the sweetest of sweet voices, Sam Cooke. Yeah.
I mean, this woman, imagine her shame. Like she would think she could only come up behind him and not make a fuss.
Good call.
I mean, 12 years. That's since, she began. If this is menstruation, I don't know, hemorrhaging, I think we've assumed that that's what's going on with her, that she's bleeding. Yeah. And it won't stop. And, 12 years of being shut out of the community, she'd have to live in a special place, cut off from society. I mean, a woman is already with the children and the slaves as lower rungs of society. So, in the Old Testament or Hebrew scripture, there are many miracles of tremendous healing and resurrection even, or people being consumed up into heaven like Moses. But it's never for women. The women are never afforded this kind of attention or treatment. So I think it's an interesting thing that the leader of the synagogue in this story has a daughter who's died, because in general, girls weren't really the valued children. Yeah. But, he wants her to live. And Jesus immediately follows. It's not at all discounted as unimportant. And then this woman, not wanting to draw attention to herself, she couldn't possibly, they would have prevented her.
Yeah,
right?
That's a good call on your part. Absolutely.
So, and it's not even said that, she doesn't even explain, like Jesus just, like he sees into the soul of Matthew. Yeah, right. He feels and sees into her soul too. And to take heart, daughter, is just such a beautiful phrase. Your faith has made you well. He doesn't even ask what's wrong with her. Yeah. But I love her internal dialogue. If I only touch his cloak, I'll be made well. So,
this is back to who we've named all these churches after. Don't we have enough St. Peter's and St. Paul's and St. John's? How about a church named after the Church of the Hemorrhaging Woman? I would go to that church in a second. Yeah. She, as you're saying, she's laying it out in the most beautiful way, and it's in her internal dialogue. She's not talking to anybody else. Yeah. There's probably nobody who wants to talk to her anymore. She's probably used to talking to herself because she's been so sent out of the community.
It's interesting to think where she came from and all that. But there's a whole. Speaking of liberation and Moses liberating his people, Jesus, I think, is doing that. He just cuts this swath through his community, and these people are coming from all directions: the synagogues, the margins, the professions that were dismissed and hard, bad to be bankers and tax collectors and stuff. So it's every strata of society that he's just good. Like liberating from their perception and their place on the margins.
Yeah.
It's really powerful.
It is. Yeah, I mean, the story comes to life in a different way in Mark and Luke's accounts. I thought I might just read a little bit from Mark's, which is quite similar to Luke's. In Mark, we get the detail that Jesus notices that power had gone out from him when he is touched. We don't get that in Matthew's. And from that results, because he says, like, who touched me? I can feel that somebody touched me, and his disciples are like, oh, so many people are touching you. What are you talking about? And he's like, no, I felt that somebody touched me because power went out from me. Who did this? And the woman we get in these other accounts kind of cowers before him. And he says the same words, or the same sorts of words, that, go in peace, your faith has made you well. So like total, love, compassion, acceptance, mercy. It doesn't matter that she's, broken a purity law. It doesn't matter that she's, got his healing power without his permission or anything like that. His only response to her is love. And yeah, I mean, we talked a little bit about the axial age in a previous podcast, that there was this explosion of consciousness, essentially, in the time that Jesus lived and in the few centuries before he lived. And I think, again, we can see that Jesus is kind of, obviously Jesus is a lot more than just this, but he's sort of like the next step in evolution when it comes to religion, when it comes to our understanding and relationship to the divine and one another and to the world, in light of our understanding and relationship to the divine. What was good but kind of incomplete or kind of a double-edged sword in his own tradition, where you have a law, the Torah, that's meant to guide people in their life with God, has some unfortunate side effects, like the exclusion of women who are bleeding and things like that. And so Jesus is kind of saying, oh, okay, what this is intending to do is limited in these ways. So he introduces a new paradigm, and I think that's such a compelling way to look at Jesus. What's kind of hard about that is that we haven't really done a good job of keeping up with him. The Christian tradition after Jesus kind of put women back into the places that Jesus was pulling them out of. And we do shrink him down, and we make him boring, and we make him conventional, and we make him sort of like, we make him a symbol of everything, of our prejudices and our values, which are not his values.
I think that, and one of the, build on both of what each of you said, he calls her daughter, which is a statement of love. I mean, it's so beautiful.
Incredible.
I just, as we go to finish up here, just say a word about how it is that we access Jesus and access grace, and how we access God. I learned a lot about this from Aidan Kavanaugh, one of my former professors, writing about the liturgy, in which he said the liturgy is like the hem of the Lord's garment. The liturgy itself is not the holy thing, but by touching through the liturgy, we experience the power of the divine, and that whether or not we do that through our liturgical devotional life, our communal devotional life, or whether or not we do that through our personal faith lives, that essentially what we're doing is we're reaching out, is we're trying to touch the hem of his garment, and that's what our prayers are. That's what our devotions are. The things that we carry with us, our little devotional things.
That's great.
It's the hem of the garment.
It reminds me of that Isaiah passage we talked about last time, with the hem of his, the train of his robe fills the temple. Yeah. Right.
Yeah. So we're really very pleased that you've hung in here with us for 33 minutes and 43 seconds, or whatever number we're on. Rob has given us the time to wrap it up signal here. I hope that what we've had to say has been helpful to you. We love it when you reach out to us, that you might embolden us in the things that you say, and maybe we could clarify a word or two. You can leave us a voicemail at 203-442-5002, and we'll see if we can get your questions and comments on the air. And we're coming upon our our 100th pod here in another pod or two, and Father Justin's going to make that long journey from Greenwich down here, and we're gonna gather around the Scriptures again. So, to embrace our Hebrew brothers and sisters, a little more midrash here around the table, and we invite you to midrash with us also. So peace be with you, God bless you, and may the trail of the Lord's garment touch your lives. God bless.